KZSU Stanford.
It's 3 o'clock.
Welcome back to Modern Education. I'm the host, Benjamin S. Woodford, here in the studio one more time. We got my co-host in the studio with me in another exciting conversation.
Hello.
With another exciting guest. This is Modern Education. We're with you Fridays from 3 to 4 p.m. for your commute home. Every Friday, we bring a new conversation, a new news update, a new guest, a new panel, a new something for you to consider when it comes to either getting a little bit of education yourself or learning a little bit more about education itself. And, we always try to bring you some fresh new information. You can always call us or text into the studio. The number is 855-723-9010. We do get text messages right here in the studio as well. You can hit us up on the Twitter at KZSU, at KZSUDJ. Those are our two Twitter handles. We love hearing from our studio audience, don't we? Isn't that fun?
Yes. It's always nice to hear what our audience members think about what we're talking about, lean into new perspectives.
Yeah.
It's always great.
It is so much fun, right? And, I think we have so much fun bringing these guests in each week and just getting to talk about whatever comes up. And it's really just transformative for us. I hope you out there in the audience get to have that same transformative experience every Friday from 3 to 4 p.m. We hope you will stick with us for your commute home today. Hopefully, wherever you're at, the traffic isn't too bad. And
traffic earlier today, we were going from San Francisco. And traffic is never fun.
It is like a Bay Area nemesis, isn't it? We all know when we're getting in the car, it is time to sit in traffic. You better have a good audio book going, or maybe
Ben goes towards the audiobooks.
Well, what do you do for the ride? Is it music?
A little bit of music. Okay. That'll fill the time.
Okay. Is it educational music?
I mean, I guess you could say that with the rhythm.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. I read somewhere one time that it may be that rhythm was the basis for human language, and we first started, understanding and making sense out of rhythms, and then those became speech patterns and then words, and it's very possible that rhythm is the basis of everything we ever have done. So
I think that's a valid argument.
Who is our guest today, Emily? What do we got going on?
Yes, today we are talking to Ron Rosenfeld. He has been at the forefront of growth hormone research and understanding about kind of this breakthrough scientific research about growth deficiencies. He's also a playwriter. He's written 3 different plays covering subject areas of, I'm thinking, Stanford's Mulbridge with cinematography. And
he's a multi-talented guy, right? He's done all kinds of cool stuff. Yeah,
to research, and we're blending the two things together. And here,
let's get him on the mic. Ron, how are you today?
I'm fine, Ben and Emily. Thank you for inviting me. It's really a great pleasure to be here this afternoon.
Oh, the pleasure is all ours. We're so stoked to have you in the audience. Now, I want to just kind of start giving the audience a little bit of background about you and some of the work that you've been doing, and maybe there's a story that you have that can kind of lead us into how you became this research scientist. Sort of pediatric, right?
Sure. Well,
So where did this journey?
None of it was planned, of course.
Of course, yeah.
I grew up in New York. I was an undergrad at Columbia and came to Stanford 50 years ago to go to medical school, and did all of my pediatric training and trained in addition in pediatric endocrinology with a special interest in growth disorders, what makes children grow or on occasion not grow.
How do you get into an interest like that? Was there an impetus for you or some familiarity that steered you in that direction?
Well, I was lucky when I trained here as a pediatrician. One of the faculty was a man named Raymond Hintz, and he was at that time the sole pediatric endocrinologist at Stanford. And I trained with him, did a 3-year fellowship with him, and then joined the faculty as a colleague of his in 1980. So he was really the person who turned me on to endocrinology and in particular into growth disorders.
Would you say that was a mentorship thing that brought you in?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We've talked about this before on the show about mentorships and collective knowledge and how really it's been about like how you collectively learn, and if without the mentors, it's difficult to get to that next step.
Well, so much of medicine is picking your mentor because you're largely unformed early in your training, and somebody has to point you in the right direction and inspire you on the one hand, and help you along when you run into the inevitable stumbling blocks along the way.
Sure. So I think I cut you off a little bit, right? So you had this mentor that got you interested into pediatric endocrinology. Can you break down what that even means for us?
So endocrinology really is hormonal disorders and includes a wide gamut of disorders, anything from diabetes to thyroid problems to disorders of puberty to disorders of the pituitary gland, the so-called master gland. And among other things, the pituitary gland produces growth hormone, which is the hormone that stimulates growth. But much of the research that my mentor, Dr. Hintz, did and that I followed up on was based on the realization that it is not really growth hormone itself that stimulates growth, but rather growth hormone works by stimulating production of another hormone called IGF, or insulin-like growth factor.
So it works more as a catalyst, you're saying, or a kind of a triggering point for the next?
The triggering point is a good way of thinking about it. What happens normally is that the pituitary gland secretes growth hormone. The growth hormone circulates around in your blood just like any other hormone, eventually binds to a receptor, a molecule that sort of grabs the growth hormone out of the blood, and after binding to the receptor, it stimulates the production of another hormone, IGF. And we now know that it is IGF, in fact, that actually stimulates growth.
Interesting. Okay, so there's this starting point that we all thought is the pituitary gland, and that was what we imagined actually created growth. But instead, there's actually a more full body hormone that is triggered by the pituitary gland's output. Okay.
Absolutely, Ben. I mean, you need the pituitary gland. You need growth hormone.
Right.
If you don't make growth hormone, you cannot grow. But growth hormone itself does not work directly. It works by stimulating production of IGF. And the way this came home to me, and it's a bit of a story, but let me tell you, was that in the late 1980s, a colleague living in Florida returned from a trip to Ecuador, where he had been helping an endocrinologist. And he said he had seen 6 adult women who were 3.5 feet tall.
Okay.
And he had measured their growth hormone levels, thinking that perhaps they didn't produce growth hormone. And what he found was that the growth hormone levels were sky high.
Interesting.
Off the chart. So at that time we knew, and this would have been in the mid to late 80s, that there was a very rare disorder, of which there were only about 50 cases in the world.
Oh, wow.
Where patients produce growth hormone, but they have a defect in the growth hormone receptor, so that the receptor cannot bind it. So I said, go back to Ecuador and get DNA. Fly to San Francisco directly, because there are only 50 cases in the world, and it looks like these 6 women have it.
And that's a strange thing to come across 6 in one town, right?
Absolutely. Totally unheard of.
Is that all genetic?
Well, so
or
what happened
environmental or both?
Well, it's a great question, Emily, because what happened was he went to Ecuador. I met him at SFO. I said, did you get the DNA? And he said, yes. I said, on all 6? He said, well, actually, we now have 19.
What?
19 people from this isolated area in the foothills of the Andes in Ecuador. So we tested them, and they all had a mutation in the growth hormone receptor gene. They all had this incredibly rare condition. So subsequently, I went to Ecuador with some of my students. We ended up finding over 100.
Wow.
So you've doubled the recorded cases in the planet.
So what these patients do is they can produce growth hormone. The pituitary is normal, but they cannot respond to growth hormone. And because they can't respond to growth hormone, they can't make IGF.
So is their body in overdrive trying to create more because it's not working?
The body is saying, hey, I need growth hormone.
Right.
Pituitary's churning it out, but they can't respond to it. And if you give them growth hormone, it does no good.
Right.
But what we found we could do was to bypass the defect in the growth hormone receptor and give them IGF. And so we did what was the first placebo-controlled study. We took 16 children. 8 of them we gave placebo. 8 of them we gave IGF to bypass the defect in the growth hormone receptor.
How are you able to identify these children?
Oh, it's not hard to identify them. They're extraordinarily small.
Okay, so this is very obvious even in small children.
So a 10-year-old would be the size of a 3-year-old.
Oh, wow.
And we found that the IGF worked. Now, interestingly, Ben, in this part of Ecuador, these families have lived for generations, and they're very well integrated into the society. They're not treated as outcasts.
Right.
And many of them, in fact, marry normal statured individuals and thereby perpetuate the genetic defect. And I remember we were interviewing one man who was about 3'8" tall, and he had been married and divorced from 3 normal statured women. And we asked him, how was it? And he smiled at us and said, well, you know, women, some marry you for love, some for money, and some just out of curiosity.
Maybe he had one of each.
So we now know the molecular defect. We can diagnose the condition prenatally.
Wow.
We can treat them. And in fact, what happened was that 4 or 5 years ago, because this was a big event in Ecuador, the university hosted a meeting in Quito to celebrate the 25th anniversary of that discovery.
Right.
And the meeting was so successful, 2 years ago we had a second one, and next month we will have a third one.
Oh, wow.
So it's ongoing.
So there's been a real tradition that's born out of this sort of happenstance discovery, right? And it sounds like...
There's so much in medicine that's serendipity. We were lucky to stumble on these patients.
Yeah. And it sounds like there's been some maybe growth, pardon the pun, no pun intended, but some growth in understanding other areas of... does this fall under skeletal dysplasia?
So that's a great question. One can broadly divide growth disorders, serious growth disorders, into 2 categories. On the one hand, you have hormonal abnormalities, patients who don't make growth hormone, patients who don't make IGF.
Right.
They're going to have a hormonal disorder.
So that generally falls under like pituitary dwarfism or something?
Pituitary dwarfism or something related to that.
Sure.
The patients in Ecuador would fall into that category. Skeletal dysplasias also refer to genetically transmitted disorders.
That'd be like achondroplasia, which is the more...
Exactly. Now, you've been doing your homework.
A little bit, yeah.
So achondroplasia is, in fact, the most common skeletal dysplasia. And there the defect is not hormonal. It's in the way the bones themselves grow.
Okay. Right.
And achondroplasia, if you think of the Wizard of Oz, most of the munchkins were achondroplastics. They have very short arms, very short legs, typically have an adult height of about 4 feet. And interestingly, we now know the genetic molecular defect of achondroplasia. it's been identified, and there is now a therapy that has been developed by actually by a company here in California, and they are now entering into phase 3 clinical trials, a 1-year trial of this therapy in an effort to correct the underlying skeletal abnormality.
So this is something that would be done shortly after birth, at a later age, or when would this be happening?
You're asking great questions. So because this is an inborn problem,
right?
In fact, most of the patients actually begin manifesting it in utero as fetuses.
Sure.
So the ideal therapy, which is not available yet, would be intrauterine.
So you're starting to correct this abnormality
before the patient is even born.
Before development has taken too much time.
If you can't do that, then the next best thing is to initiate therapy as early as possible.
Sure.
To try and ameliorate the skeletal defect.
Now, I know there are some ethical concerns around this kind of treatment because at some level, a lot of people, who have grown up and lived with various forms of achondroplasia or other afflictions, or maybe it's not even right to call them afflictions, but just conditions, see this as or some people may see this as kind of a possibility of sort of wiping their culture and their existence off the map. And I'm curious if the doctors that are developing this stuff, or yourself, how you feel about this sort of dichotomy between trying to fix the difficulties for someone growing up versus almost annihilating a possible identity.
It's an excellent and very important question. So let's deal for a moment with achondroplasia, the most common form of skeletal dysplasia. So 80% of cases are spontaneous mutations, meaning that both the parents are entirely normal.
Okay.
And they're expecting a normal baby, and bang, the baby is born and has achondroplasia, totally surprising them. 80%. If you speak to parents of a newborn with achondroplasia or a young child with achondroplasia, the overwhelming majority, in my experience, wants you to do anything you can that's safe, that can help correct as much as possible the underlying defect. On the other hand, if you speak to adults who have achondroplasia and have lived with it for 20, 30, 40 years, many of them say, we don't think of ourselves as abnormal. Yeah. We've lived with this. We recognize that we're different than other people, the normal stature people, but every person has something askew with them.
Right.
We're fine. The problem is not with us, it's with you and the way you perceive people. And we perhaps don't want any intervention. Interestingly, we met with the Food and Drug Administration about 6 months ago. They had an open panel meeting, and there were over 30 individuals who came and spoke to the FDA. Some were parents, some were children or teenagers with achondroplasia, some were adults. Of those 30, 29 out of the 30 said, FDA, please, if there's a drug that can help us, make it available. But 1 out of the 30 said, I accept it. I don't need any intervention. My feeling is that if a therapy does emerge that is safe and effective, you offer it to the family, and the family then can make a decision, and we as physicians respect that decision. And there's some who will say, I'm okay with the way I am. I don't need any intervention. And there are others who will say, please, if the therapy is available and it's safe, let's go with it.
So I'm going to push back on this for a little while, and I hope you'll just engage with me on this. And I wonder at some level should there be, or do you think there is already, a level of education and understanding that parents should grapple with before they make a decision like this?
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I think it's part of our responsibility as physicians to lay out all of the facts as best we can, including the fact that every drug has side effects, some of which we may not know.
Right.
And that has to be factored into the equation also, as well as expense. These drugs are expensive, and somebody has to pay for them, whether it's the insurance company or the family or whatever.
Can you give us a ballpark? Like, say that this treatment is viable and this stage 3 works.
If we deal with growth hormone, okay, which has been, recombinant growth hormone has been available now for 34 years.
Okay.
It, on average, costs $10,000 to $20,000 per year of therapy. If you start treating somebody, say, at the age of 2, and you treat them until they finish growing, let's say 15, you're talking about 13 years of treatment at $10,000 to $20,000 per year.
Wow.
Now, we don't know what the cost is going to be for the drug for achondroplasia. It's just being tested.
Yeah.
But the market for achondroplasia is much smaller than the market for growth hormone deficiency.
Which means the cost stays even higher.
It's going to be higher.
Wow.
So what is the market value for growth hormones?
So when recombinant growth hormone first came on the market in 1985, the only approved indication was growth hormone deficiency, children who don't make growth hormone. But over the ensuing 5 or 10 years, we found that growth hormone, in fact, can make lots of short children grow better, even if they are capable of making growth hormone, just by giving excess growth hormone.
Inches.
Well, wait, when you say better, you're saying grow taller than they would have
better
naturally.
is perhaps not the right word. Can grow taller, yes.
Sure.
Can grow taller.
Sure.
So those are now approved indications for growth hormone in the United States. So essentially, just to simplify matters, any child who is below the first percentile, so 1 out of 100 children in the United States can qualify for growth hormone therapy.
That's statistically like 3 standard deviations
it's
away.
Two and a half standard. Okay. Actually, it's 2.25 standard deviations.
Okay. Yeah.
The United States is more liberal in the use of growth hormone than most other countries. The worldwide market for growth hormone now is probably about $2 to $3 billion.
Wow.
Okay.
So
there's a market out there.
So now, getting away from the sort of like the stripping of a cultural identity and just thinking about this cost piece, right? What it sounds like is happening is we're creating a class of designer babies that only rich people can afford to create.
I mean, yeah, with the price tag.
Is that a reality that you're grappling with as you work through this stuff?
It is absolutely a concern. And we can say that any child who is below 2.25 standard deviations can qualify for therapy. But who's going to pay for it?
Right.
If you don't have insurance, the cost becomes prohibitive. If you look at the growth hormone market, about two-thirds to 3/4 of the patients receiving growth hormone are males. Why? It should be evenly distributed between males and females.
There's less social stigma for a woman to be short, right?
Parents are more concerned about short boys than there are short girls. In fact, it's such a concern that often girls with significant and curable or treatable causes of short stature are not referred because the parents aren't concerned or the doctor isn't concerned.
Well, I assume in a lot of other countries, even the girls just don't get a priority in the same way that the boys do, regardless of the appearance parts, right?
You know, all of us pediatric endocrinologists, we sort of keep private records of the most absurdly referred case to us. Mm-hmm. So I had a call from a doctor in Nevada a number of years ago asking if I would treat his teenage son. So I said, well, how tall is your son? And he said, 5'10". And I said, well, I'm 5'10". I don't treat people to be taller than me.
Yeah.
And he said, you don't understand. He's got a great outside shot. If he could just rebound, I know he'd get a scholarship.
Oh, my gosh.
And I think I mentioned to you the other day that I'd been away from Stanford for 9 years. I went to Oregon for 9 years. When I came back in 2002, the first day I was back, I picked up the Stanford Daily, and there was a full-page advertisement looking for a Stanford egg donor.
Right.
And what they said was that they would pay $100,000. That's $100,000. The individual had to have no underlying medical illnesses.
Sure.
No serious family history. Had to have a combined SAT score, I think it was above 1,400.
Right.
And had to be at least 6 feet tall. So they were looking for a Stanford female donor.
Amazonian woman with a large brain.
So we could just imagine what their goal would be.
Sure.
And if you look at, if you just go online and Google sperm banks, many of the sperm banks are soliciting donations from taller males.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's all
That's what parents are.
Well, you know, I'm a 6'4", 200 plus pound
you can make
Stanford
a lot of money
PhD.
donating.
What's my sperm worth?
There you go.
I'm just playing around. I
give up radio broadcasting and become a sperm.
Yeah, I mean, this pays really well in volunteer radio, but maybe I could use a little extra. Anyway,
interested in Ben's sperm? And call in at 855.
Okay, let's move on from that topic.
Let me just add one interesting byline.
Yeah.
So when I was in training in the 1970s, it was fashionable for girls to be short. Parents wanted short girls. So the only way at that time to do that was to give estrogen to 9 or 10-year-old girls to push them through puberty, because estrogen causes your growth plates to fuse. Well, nowadays, tall girls are what most parents want. So societal values.
There's a little bit of like the cultural implications, like you especially like how you're mentioning with gender, and then historically, like how the vision has changed.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it does. It waxes and wanes like that. I mean, you know, Marilyn Monroe was a very busty woman, and in her time, everybody thought she was the picture of beauty. And now, if you look in magazines,
look at paintings from the 1700s, 1800s.
Sure.
Look at what was considered the vision of beauty then. It just changed.
Sure. And you know, obesity used to be a sign of wealth, and now it is heavily biased against in our society, and in fact, continues to become more and more biased.
People are shamed for it now.
Sure. And there's this this reality that what's desirable right now, a generation from now, may not be.
So your underlying question, Ben, is a very important one, and one that really does trouble us, which is how do we direct therapy to the patients who really need it and are most deserving?
Right.
And it's a challenging issue.
Yeah, and I want to jump back a little bit, because this has come up in a couple of different ways already. This idea of normal kids, or, you know, I'm doing air quotes here. Those don't go over well on the radio, but normal kids getting treated with these growth hormones just for the sort of, I guess I want to call it vanity of the parents, right? A 5'10"
It's cosmetic. I mean, let's face it. It is cosmetic therapy,
right?
And you know, one can have some. some sympathy for it. It's not a ridiculous desire. I mean, everybody wants their child to be
normal,
beautiful, or
Yeah.
as Garrison Keillor used to say, everybody wants their child to be above average.
Sure. Which is numerically impossible, but hilarious to think about, right?
And one way to think about therapy is if we say we're going to treat the bottom 1%, well, no matter how many people we treat, there's always going to be a bottom 1%. We're just going to
Right. We're just shifting the floor,
it's
right?
like the labor union leader who said that his union would not rest until every wage earner earned above average.
Yeah, that's like 90% of people believe they are above average, which is clearly wrong. Okay. So, Emily,
what I find interesting too, is like what you're talking about, kind of like the consequences of research and some of the innovations that we have. And I mean, we're seeing it in so many different technologies, being, for example, the internet to self-driving cars even. And so, I mean, how would you say, since the 80s, with all this time developing this research, what would you say are some of the consequences that you've been faced with, as we've been kind of talking with?
Well, let me give you an example from my own experience,
Okay.
which really drives this home. So, the only growth hormone that works therapeutically in humans is human growth hormone. Bovine
like a
growth hormone, pig growth hormone,
okay.
dog growth hormone, it doesn't work. So for many years, beginning in the 1950s, the only way to get growth hormone was to extract it from human cadaver pituitary glands.
Wow.
And this was done worldwide. Pituitary glands would be collected. The growth hormone would be laboriously extracted and then administered to patients who couldn't make growth hormone. In the early 1980s, a patient of ours at Stanford came to clinic. This was a child that I had been involved in his care when I was an intern at Stanford. Mm-hmm. I came in at the age of 6. I helped take care of him. He was diagnosed as growth hormone deficient, and he received this pituitary extract growth hormone for 10 years, from the age of 6 to 16, and then we lost him to medical follow-up. Mm-hmm. Came back to Stanford 4 years later with a stumbling gait, discoordination, mumbling speech. We had no idea what was going on, but clearly he had some neurological problem. Within the space of a year, he died. Wow. And at autopsy, he turned out to have a very rare condition called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease.
What is that?
Now, this is related to mad cow disease.
Oh, wow.
Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease was first identified, or the origin of it, in New Guinea by a pediatrician who ended up getting the Nobel Prize for it, a man named Gatashek. And there was a primitive tribe of cannibals that when they defeated their enemies, they would either eat the brain of their deceased enemies, or they would insert a stick into the brain and suck on it, and then 10 or 20 years later, they would develop this disease and die, which they called Kuru.
Okay.
We now know that this is due to a prion.
Right.
And it turns out that some of the cadaver pituitary glands contained this prion, and it was in the growth hormone that we administered to this child.
So mad cow is spread in the same basic way.
Same way.
Brain matter gets into like ground beef or something similar.
The case was reported in the early 80s, and while it was being debated whether or not it was possible that growth hormone could have caused it, 3 more cases appeared in the United States and England, all in young individuals who had received growth hormone.
So this is a byproduct of using cadaver pituitary
in the brain.
growth hormones.
Exactly.
Okay.
Every country except France stopped the distribution of pituitary growth hormone. France said, our purification procedure eliminates the prion. We're going to continue giving it.
And have they had any cases?
20 more cases in France.
Okay, so that's not working. Yeah.
So in 1983, pituitary growth hormone was pulled.
Okay.
And by 1985, recombinant growth hormone, synthetic growth hormone, became available. So for me, this was dramatic evidence that every treatment, no matter how safe you think it is, has a risk to it.
Right.
And, as we get more technologically advanced with gene sequencing and with intrauterine therapy and with gene therapy, we have to be cognizant of the fact that there is going to be a consequence to every one of these dramatic therapeutic advances.
And this is what you mentioned earlier about, when you're giving a parent this lowdown on what they should know before they make a decision,
Absolutely.
Is that there may be long-standing or unknown.
Absolutely. And I always sit down with families in whom I recommend growth hormone, and I say, here's why I recommend it, but here are the fortunately very rare side effects that can occur with synthetic growth hormone, none of which I should say have ever, in my experience, interfered with growth hormone therapy because they're very rare, but there are always unknown risks. There are always unknown risks.
Right.
Even aspirin, we know, has a risk to it.
Right. And that is, I think, something a lot of people don't necessarily think about when they go into medical situations. The doctor says, here's a pill, take this pill, it will help your symptoms. And we go, okay, doctor, I believe you, right?
Told me, so I have to.
And so I think you're bringing up something that is maybe a good point for anyone going in for medical treatment. Myself, I've had sadly, so much time in hospitals. I feel pretty confident that I understand this well, but it's the idea of directing your own care and understanding the underlying things that you're being treated for and why.
It's just important to have this conversation with your physician.
Right.
And, to say, okay, what do you expect of your therapy? What are the potential risks of the therapy?
Right. And taking some time to become educated yourself, too, I think is really important. Yeah. People I think open access is a really important thing, especially in medical journals and things like that. And one of our guests came on, John Walensky, and talked to us about open access. And he made the point that a lot of medical research is becoming available through this open access movement. As it should be, right. And one of the great side effects of that access to information is that patients now are able to become a lot more self-educated and become better agents for their own understanding of what's happening within medical treatments. And I personally believe that it's a very necessary part of getting into any kind of medical treatment that is, anything that's not just run-of-the-mill average stuff. Take that time, ask your doctor about those side effects, and actually take the time to really dig into understanding as best you can for yourself. Yeah.
It also kind of breaks down the idea that, at least for me, that doctors or physicians are like magicians. They just stroke of their wand and they make you feel better. Possibly, I have no clue what you're doing, but I trust you. But with the open access, it gives more of that understanding, more of the power to the people to be able to make the decision informed. So it's definitely a good point to bring up.
I think it's not just around growth hormone ideas.
Yeah, it's anything.
Any medical procedure in general. A lot of people don't even realize going in for a simple tooth getting pulled, you're going under anesthesia, and there's a non-zero percentage of dying every time you go in under anesthesia, right? And so it's just something to think about anyway, being well informed, right? You got another question up your sleeve there, Emily? You look like you're burning with a question.
I was looking at my notes trying to see where we can take it next, but I'm thinking about overall how much time or how aggressively should we be going and finding patients who are short stature and for treatment.
Are you asking, like, what are the reasons why you would need treatment versus just looking at aesthetics? Is that kind of what you're hinting at?
I think that's actually a good way to point it out, is through the cosmetic lens. Because as well, we see it through cosmetology. Like, you could say, like, if you broke your nose and now you can't breathe, and then they do cosmetology, and now people
cosmetic
just
surgery, right? Cosmetology, I believe, is makeup.
Okay, there we go. Well, both.
I'm not worried about the cosmetic aspect. Mm-hmm. I actually spend more time talking families out of treatment than into treatment. We in general have the means to be able to reasonably predict how tall a child is going to end up being when the child is going to go through puberty. And I spend a lot of time trying to reassure families. What concerns me more are the children who should be seen by a pediatrician or pediatric endocrinologist, should be evaluated, and don't make it into the system.
So what are some of the circumstances that you think should be evaluated or get looked at?
Criteria.
What would be the signals for a parent to know?
Well, I mean, if we deal specifically with the issue of growth, I think parents in general are pretty attuned to how their child stacks up in terms of stature compared to his or her peers.
Okay.
And I think if a family is concerned, that's the opportunity to discuss it with your pediatrician or with your general practitioner. Have the physician plot the child's height and weight on a growth chart, track how the child is growing, and if there's any concern or question, make the referral to an appropriate pediatric endocrinologist who has the experience to be able to evaluate whether this is within the broad range of normal or whether it represents a pathological pattern of growth that needs evaluation.
Right.
So, I think the over-referrals, which certainly do occur, especially in an affluent, educated area like the Bay Area. Those we deal with. We reassure the family. Mm-hmm. What concerns me most are the patients who don't get referred or don't get referred until it's too late to have a meaningful intervention.
And this is most likely disproportionately affecting poor families that don't have the kind of medical support and even insurance coverage.
When I many years ago, when I was in elementary school, they measured annually the height and weight of every child in school. There'd be a school nurse who would do it. For whatever reason, cost reason, budgetary reasons, that's no longer done. And it's unfortunate because that kind of health screening is a way to pick up, not just children who aren't growing properly, but children whose vision is impaired, children whose hearing is impaired, children who are overweight or underweight.
And it's a huge piece of scientific data, too, right? To be able to look at kids over many years and actually see the trends.
And a lot of it is prevention in the medical field. It's better to get it before it's too late.
Absolutely.
So when is it too late to give a child, or once they've developed growth hormones?
Good question.
So a normal child will grow all through childhood. During adolescence, both boys and girls have a growth spurt, and then eventually the growth plates fuse. Once the growth plates fuse, you can't grow anymore.
So that's after puberty?
After puberty.
Okay.
Now, there's an interesting story in that regard, because the question is, what is it during puberty that causes your growth plates to fuse? For many years, people thought it was testosterone, that it was androgens. both males and females produce androgens during puberty.
You told us earlier it was estrogen, right?
It's estrogen.
Yeah.
But let me tell you how that was discovered.
Okay,
It's
please.
An interesting story.
Ooh, we love a story.
So about 30 years ago in Cincinnati, a 28-year-old man shows up in an orthopedic clinic complaining about knee pain and knock knees and whatever. And they measure him, and he's 6'8" or 6'10".
So his growth plates hadn't fused?
Well, they didn't know that at the time, but
Sure.
he was unusually tall.
Yeah.
And they asked him, tell us about your growth pattern. And he said, well, I was always average stature, and when I graduated high school, I was 5'10", but I just kept growing. For the next 10 years,
Right.
I just kept growing and growing. Now, when an endocrinologist hears that, we first think, well, maybe this male never went into puberty. Maybe for whatever reason his pituitary gland wasn't producing the hormones you need to go through puberty. But this guy had totally gone through puberty. He was shaving every day. He
Right.
was sexually active, in normal libido. And when they did an X-ray, his growth plates were wide open.
Wow.
Open. And it turned out he had a mutation in the gene for the estrogen receptor.
Okay.
So he couldn't uptake estrogen at all?
Exactly. So what happens is he goes through puberty, he produces testosterone. Like all men, some of the testosterone is converted to estrogen. That's why a lot of teenagers get a little bit of breast development during puberty.
Okay.
He makes estrogen, but he can't respond to the estrogen because he has a defect in the estrogen receptor. And so what they had to do was surgically staple his growth plates together, or he would have
Wow.
kept growing forever because his
Can
growth
you help me understand where these growth plates reside? Well, I'm having trouble visualizing.
They reside at the ends of your long bones.
It's like
So the
your
long
femur.
bones of
Yeah,
your
yeah.
arms,
Okay.
okay, your femur, your femur, your radius and ulna. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry.
Humerus.
Humerus,
Yeah,
radius
yeah.
and ulna, in your leg, femur, and tibia.
Yeah.
At the ends of those bones, there's cartilage, not just the cartilage in your joints,
Sure.
but cartilage at the end of the bones, which is where growth hormone and IGF work.
Is it kind of like the concrete? Say, okay, we're now cementing ourselves
Right,
up.
and then when you go through puberty under the influence of estrogen, those growth plates fuse.
So that cartilage essentially hardens into
Disappears
bone.
and the bone
Yeah,
ends
yeah.
fuse.
Okay.
And then you can't grow anymore.
So was this gentleman essentially getting longer and longer limbs, and his torso
Longer and
was
longer
mostly
limbs. Right.
established?
His spine wouldn't get longer.
Right.
But his legs and his arms would get longer and longer.
Okay, like a Conan O'Brien. Anyway, he's a very tall, lanky guy.
Good comedian.
Interesting. Okay, so we basically found this special case, and was this a discovery that helped us? Was this the what chain reaction turned into understanding this growth plate?
In a way, this is very similar to the story I told you from Ecuador.
Right.
Patients in Ecuador have a mutation in the growth hormone receptor. The patient from Cincinnati, a mutation in the estrogen receptor. We call these kinds of cases prismatic cases.
Okay.
Because it's as if the patient is saying, there's something wrong with me, figure it out, because if you can figure it out, it's going to tell you a lot about the underlying physiology of the body.
Right. It almost unlocks an entirely new paradigm of how to go about researching this.
Exactly.
That's neat. So it's for you. It's strange for the man because he's the guinea pig, but for you, this is like a gold mine, right?
Exactly.
You find
And so an example of this is, if I can take a minute.
Please.
So I told you earlier that growth hormone works by binding to a receptor and causing the cell to produce IGF.
right.
But nobody knew how. After growth hormone binds to the receptor, how does it turn on IGF? So about 15 years ago, I got an email from a colleague in Argentina that they had a teenage girl that looked like she had the same defect as Ecuador, But when they looked at the gene for the growth hormone receptor, it was normal.
Huh.
So I said, I want this family.
Get her DNA, quick.
Send
her DNA to San Francisco.
And we studied this family.
Yeah.
And they turned out to be the first case of a defect in a gene called STAT5. And we now know that STAT5 is the critical link between the growth hormone receptor and IGF. So growth hormone is produced by the pituitary. Yeah. It binds to the growth hormone receptor. It stimulates STAT5, and STAT5 turns on IGF. This was the first case. We now have about a dozen cases worldwide of this very, very rare condition.
Wow. And that's so interesting because it seems to just keep, by chance, you run across this one special case, and that becomes the jumping off point for
What I always tell my students is it's the cases that you don't understand that you should be most interested in.
Right.
Because the patients are trying to tell us something.
Well, that's true for me in education as well. You know, there's this idea that I'm a math educator primarily, and there's a lot of understanding in many math education circles that people are really looking for right answers because they think that verifies some kind of understanding. And my point of view, and I think a lot of researchers in education are starting to get to this idea, is that your mistakes are really the points to put your attention to, right? As soon as a kid can get 5 answers right, we're done. Exactly. There's nothing left to teach there, right? And it sort of parallels, I think, the same idea of look at the hard cases, look at the things that don't make sense. Don't just dive in on the run of the mill, because that's always, that's pretty much understood already, right? Mm-hmm. And so, at least from an education standpoint, I find it very interesting to always think, okay, what are we not getting? Let's dig in on the mistakes, because that's really where the fruit is to be had, right? Now, we only have a few minutes left. I know these hours go by so fast. I'd love to pick your brain for a couple more, honestly.
Slim pickings.
Yeah. I seriously doubt that, Ron. But I'm curious, just sort of wrapping it up here, if you wanted to tell me, like, what is the best part about being able to do this work, looking at human growth and understanding how that works for you? What is the...
Well, I mean, it's very satisfying to be able to take a child who would not have been capable of growing normally and help him or her achieve a normal stature. And to... Very importantly, because by the time these children come to you, they're already stigmatized, to be able to convince them that there's really nothing seriously wrong, that you're okay, that you just need this one hormone or this one therapy to get you on track.
Right. Okay. So that sounds like a very human look at what you're really talking about, right? It's being able to help people, and that's why you're probably doing it, right? So let's flip the coin. What's the hardest part about all of this work and body of research you've spent a lifetime now working on?
Well, the hardest part, of course, are the cases you can't figure out. The families that come to you, you know there's something wrong. You're just not capable of figuring it out. But even there, times have changed. So what I always tell, again, my students is the case that you can't figure out, take some blood, put it in the freezer. Get some DNA, put it in the freezer, because one day, and this has happened to me now many times, you'll pick up a journal and somebody will have discovered a new genetic abnormality, and you'll say, wait a minute, I saw a case just like that 3 years ago. Go back to the freezer, and lo and behold, if you can then make the diagnosis, you've figured it out.
Wow, I really, really love this because there's so many levels of richness in that idea. I mean, the patience, right? Having to take the time to say, okay, I don't have a solution to this problem sitting right in front of me right now, but I'm going to document it well, and I'm going to plan ahead, and I'm going to think that there is always a possibility of getting there.
Exactly.
And that's powerful on a scientific level.
That's why open access and publishing, findings in journals, and having meetings and speaking to colleagues. Nowadays, it's so easy. You just send an email to a colleague and say, hey, I have a case just like that.
Right. And that is just a powerful, and I'm even thinking just on a life philosophy level, not every problem needs to be solved right away. Some problems can be sort of, so to speak, set on the shelf for a while and let to simmer until new information comes up, right? And to me, that's more than just a scientific breakthrough or a way to get to a breakthrough. That is really a sort of life lesson. And I think that's a great way for us to leave off for today. Ron, thank you so much.
Really my pleasure.
This has been a joy. So we've just been sitting with Ron Rosenfeld, who is a professor and teacher and researcher, and he has been looking at human growth hormones and how to help young people to be able to achieve full statures, and also a lot of other basic science connected to that. So thank you so much, Ron. I am the host of Modern Education, Benjamin S. Woodford, here once again in the studio with my co-host Emily.
Hello.
As we have been talking with Ron and really getting into some interesting stuff around stature and some of the philosophical and medical implications of that. So we are here every Friday from 3 to 4 p.m. for your commute. We hope that you will continue to tune in each week as we bring you fresh new guests, understandings, conversations, and hopefully a little bit of fun and some laughs along the way. I will be back next week, Friday, from 3 to 4 p.m. And I don't know if my co-host will be here next week, but we will be back each week with a new show and a little bit of growth for you. Coming up next is Scott Moulton with Party Time. He'll be throwing down some fresh new beats for the following hour. I always love rocking out as I'm heading home from the studio, and I'm sure he'll have something great for you. So this is Ben Woodford with Modern Education, signing off.